and we're just going to roll right into the agenda. Rachel, I think you have some things that you want to share with respect to your second draft and findings from November. So we'll go ahead and get started with you.
Yeah, okay. Let me move this so it doesn't look like I'm looking off to the side. I have 3 screens and the camera is in the wrong place right now. Hang on. Okay, now it doesn't look like I'm staring at somebody else. All right, so after the November meeting, there were a couple of things that the task force had asked us to update. I'd put the updates in yellow. So the red is still, the red line is from what we presented before, and then for the things that we discussed, I put the updates in yellow. So this one here, 27, 28, 23, 8D, there was a lot of discussion about this, and the committee, or this committee, wanted to insert the word annual to make it a little bit more clear. So now it reads, a charter school shall give an enrollment preference to underserved children as defined in section 3728.5 until the charter school meets its required annual underserved student composition, to make it clear that this is that every year they have to meet that thing. There's still the second sentence there. There was a bit of back and forth about whether or not the second sentence was required. But I left it there because I didn't have clear notes about where we eventually came down on that second sentence. And then should I pause there?
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Then the next part was, we had some discussion about whether or not we should recommend that the legislature update the definition of underserved student, because there's an issue now, a growing issue of more school districts moving to the community eligibility provision. Under that provision, their free lunch statistics are starting to become distorted, because now all kids get that once they hit those benchmarks.
Right.
We did go back, and Jean went back and asked MDE for us, and MDE said they're still using free lunch as it is, because that is what is in MSIS and currently what's required under MAP. They are apparently having some discussions with the legislature about this topic. So at this point in time, I don't think it would necessarily be wise for us to recommend a legislative change to put us in misalignment with MAP, because we don't know, you know, we could pick something and they might pick something different. But I do think it would be something that, if MAP does change, that we should ask at that time that our underserved requirement change at the same time, so that they can be aligned. And in the meantime, this is just a suggestion from Rachel, not from the other 2 members of the subcommittee. If the authorizer board determines that numbers are getting particularly distorted in any given school district because of this issue, then there could be some things the authorizer board could do on the regulatory side in terms of the application of consequences. If a school falls short of that underserved definition, primarily because of this data distortion issue, rather than right now making a change in the law, since we don't really have a clear direction to go with that one. If you scroll down a little bit more, for the virtual school one, I think where I had it in my notes was that the consensus was for MCSAB to develop policy around the circumstances under which courses would be approved or not approved, or how to get courses approved by MCSAB. And then we had a long discussion about the issue with teacher qualifications. And we came down and we went back and forth about how to do it. And ultimately the consensus was, for people, everybody that was still on the call at that point in time, was to actually just move the bar from 25% to 50%. And then that would give a lot more flexibility, and we wouldn't need to get into this counts, this doesn't count, because it would just give a lot more flexibility. And to go ahead and sort of recommend a 50% exemption. I think I think that's where we landed after the November meeting. We did send this around via email to our task force, like our little subcommittee, to make sure that this was accurate to where we had landed. But if anybody has different recollections, I guess now is the time to speak.
On the teacher piece, I think that's great, and I'm definitely supportive of that. I guess I'd be interested in hearing from charter schools, either on the call or maybe in a different way, if this is a little bit too small of a group for this. But my understanding is that, you know, this doesn't provide as much flexibility as some people would like, just because teachers do have to still get licensed very quickly. Even if they're in that percentage, and that I can't remember if we discussed this and tabled it, so please tell me if we already said no, we're not interested in this. But this idea, to me, just based on my conversations with charter schools, it seems like it would be helpful to include some kind of ability for them to hire people who are not certified and really never have to be certified. And that while this percentage is helpful and an increased percentage is helpful, that they're still on the hook for these people to get certified very quickly, which I think has consequences, well, a number of consequences for hiring and staffing up and all of that. So anyway, that's a thought. If that goes beyond what we want to discuss today, we can table it, but yeah.
And so when we had this conversation last time, I think several people, because the conversation went on so long, several people had to hop off the call, but I see Tamala and Katie and Christy all on the call right now. So if you all, because the way to do what Elise is suggesting is to basically to delete that sentence, that last sentence that says within 3 years. That would be the way to do what Elise is suggesting. But since we do have you all on the call this time, does anybody want to speak up about that?
On our end, we are working to get our teachers licensed. I think what's challenging is no more than 50% may be exempt. And that's not like taking into account the 3-year period. So like if they are, they're counted as against this. And I think if we had that, like no more than 50% of the teachers who have been at the school for, you know, some period of time, like a year or two, because I think it does take that time. And so it's hard, you know, knowing that we can't do these things overnight and we don't really have a ton of flexibility. I think the 50%, the 75%, it's not super flexible when we are working towards certification and licensure. So if there could be more flexibility, knowing that we're working towards that and making progress toward that, I think that would be helpful on our end. I mean, of course, no requirement at all would be great, but I think considering there is a requirement where we can have flexibility that acknowledges the time it takes would be really helpful.
Christy, Tamala?
Yeah, so I do think, and I completely agree with what Katie said. I mean, the 50% certainly does help. Ultimately, to be able to strike out the last sentence helps even more with flexibility. And, you know, like I said, on our end, we've had some really great teachers who, you know, are not certified. And I'm not sure if they went to get certified, it would make them a better teacher per se. So, you know, I kind of agree with what Katie said. As much flexibility as we had, you know, with around the time constraint of that would be helpful. But being able to strike that last sentence would be, you know, ultimately helpful. I just don't know that that's a doable thing.
Hi, it's Tamala. I don't have anything new to add. I agree with the sentiments that have been shared.
Thank you, Tamala.
I had a question because I had to leave that call that Rachel was talking about with this. And my understanding is that whether you're in a charter or not, that within a 3 years, that applies to any, let's just talk about teachers in non-charter public schools, that they have to adhere to this within 3 years. They need to be licensed. And from what I understand it, the whole process of getting admitted to a program and getting through the program and doing all the requirements takes about 3 years. So it almost seems like if the desire is to have, I don't even know what the 50% does. It's almost like, I think I said this before, the no more than 25% or no more than 50%, it almost is meaningless if all the people have to get within that pathway to be licensed and they have 3 years to do it. So I don't know if that made sense. It's like a special requested administrator license in a typical public, regular public school, that if someone wants to hire me, I'm not licensed, they get the provisional license for me, but I'm in the process of getting it, and I have 3 years. So if that's me, am I counted in that 50%? I would think we don't even have to talk about 50%, because if the rule is you have to be licensed within 3 years, then why is there a cap on how many people are in that pipeline to do it?
I think that's a really good point. I think that is essentially, you just sort of, I think a couple of years ago, this wouldn't have made you any different from a traditional public school. I know recently DE has come back and said, you have to start the certification process by the first year, even if you have an emergency or a non-renewable license. And I guess that would be a slight difference. At least it seems laid out in the law here, although charter schools could speak to how this actually works. It seems like at least if you have pursued that and gotten it within 3 years, whenever you did that in a 3-year period, that there's a little bit of flexibility there that's different from a traditional public school currently. But other than that, I mean, it's not, I agree with that. It's not creating very much flexibility, because ultimately everyone has to be on a track towards licensure, and has to achieve that within 3 years. So.
I want to ask a question, and probably this is for Rachel. Initially, when there was work, and I don't know, Elise, if you were involved in this or not at all, but when there was work on the legislation, do you know or recall where that 25% came from initially, and why there wasn't just an option to say, charter schools must comply with applicable federal laws, rules, and regulations regarding qualifications of teachers, period? Because we know if we're teaching special education, we have to follow the federal regulations there, right? But then leaving the flexibility for other teachers to be positions to be staffed with a certified and or someone who's not. Do you know where that came from?
Yeah, so this is essentially what happened. The charter advocates wanted there to be an exemption,
Mm-hmm.
that charter schools could hire licensed, that state certification wouldn't matter, provided that, and this was in the era of No Child Left Behind still, and so there was still the highly qualified teacher bar in the federal law. And so what the charter advocates wanted was charter school teachers should meet the highly qualified bar, which is just a bachelor's degree and that subject matter competency, and whether or not they were state licensed, that would be fine. And what happened was that there was I hate to call it a rumor, but it was like that, that was being promoted by some superintendents in the legislature who convinced many legislators that if charter schools were allowed not to have licensed teachers, that the state of Mississippi would lose Title I, period. This was obviously not true. Because actually federal law says that charter school teachers do not have to have state licensure, to maintain federal whatever. And we actually, Mississippi First and the other advocates at the time actually had to put out a white paper explaining what the federal law said about highly qualified teacher and charter schools, in order for people to understand that charter school teachers could be exempt. And so because we ended up going down that pathway with the opposition at the time, which was superintendents, and that was actually at the time, Tom Burnham was at the department, And
Okay.
he had been pushing this idea that was wrong, but he was one of the ones that was pushing it.
Gotcha.
And it scared enough people that in the political back and forth, 25% was what we could get. So it wasn't like a magical, this makes any sense. It was really a political compromise.
Gotcha.
And since then, obviously, you know, ESSA passed in 2015. And so all of this has changed so dramatically. And then MDE has changed all its policies as well. So we are just in a different political context than we were in at that time.
Okay, thank you for that. So is there a way then to add additional flexibility here at this point in time, knowing that NCLB has gone by the wayside, knowing that we're under the rules and regulations of ESSA now, and that we could actually increase the flexibility by ensuring that our schools, all of our schools, because they are public schools, that they are responsible for complying with everything that's federal, regardless, right? Special ed, IDEA, Title I, whatever, and rules and regulations regarding teachers, period. And then leaving in the language about administrators of charter schools are exempt from state licensure, blah, 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 and then stop talking, you know? Just to eliminate everything else and just ensure that our schools are responsible for ensuring that special ed teachers meet the qualifications for special ed, and we meet the federal guidance, period. So we protect faith.
Yeah. So essentially what you're saying is delete the sentence that starts with no more than, delete the sentence that starts with however.
Yeah.
And
None of
delete, and then the rest of the, basically the rest of the paragraph.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So
Yeah.
basically the only two sentences would be charter schools must comply and then administrators of charter schools.
I'm just wondering if that's too much of a lift or too much of an ask, or if that's even reasonable. It gives tons of flexibility to the schools then, but it also ensures that they remain in compliance with federal law, and that, you know, the flexibility is there for their school administrators.
So I think it is entirely a question of whether or not we think we could sell it.
Yeah.
Because I mean, just putting the federal law as the minimum bar, you do that in the first sentence.
Right.
I think it's just a question of, do we think this is something we can get the Senate, which has changed? Do we think this is something we can get the Senate to accept? And I think it really depends. Like at the time that this controversy happened, we did not expect this to be the thing that made people's heads explode. And then it randomly became the thing that made people's heads explode. I guess random is not the word, but you know, it's just always hard to predict. So if it does become the thing that makes, like, we could try as like that could be like the initial, like put it in the bill that way. And then like, can we agree on like, okay, if we can't get that, what is our next most preferred? Because if, you know, because we want to at least advance the ball down the field, even if we can't get our most preferred.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Because at the end of the day, so to speak, everything is going to be based on outputs anyway, right? So the charter schools are going to have to ensure that those children are getting the quality instruction that they need, and it's going to be evidenced by their outcomes on their student assessments and their so forth and so on. So how they instruct those children really there should be flexibility in there, and there should be some relief from all of the guidelines and the standards and so forth, where it's not impacted by federal law. So I'm just wondering if that's an option that the committee would want to take, to reach for the moon and, you know, hope to land among the stars, right? So just a question kind of for everybody, a little feedback from folks. I'd love it.
I mean, I'm just for my personal, I'm willing to you know, put like our reach ask in the recommendations, just with the understanding that if we get pushback on this point, which it's really hard to predict if this is going to be the thing, that we have some sort of consensus around like where are we willing to say like, okay, but we at least want this, because you know that point about charter schools are held accountable to outcomes, you know, that was our like thing that we really pushed hard before. And like I said, I just think it's going to be hard to know like
So maybe
if we
our plan B is the language around 50%.
That's what I would say too.
I think with that last sentence, at least delete it. I would
And you
say
don't-
is
yeah,
a plan.
And you don't need the last, whatever the proposal is, you don't need the last sentence.
Right.
Because if you have,
Right.
Yeah.
that if you keep the one about the 50% and they have to adhere to state requirements, then that is the state requirement, that 3-year timeframe.
Right.
Maybe this is throwing a whole wrench in the conversation. Is this not a higher standard for charter schools than traditional public schools? Because traditional public schools don't have a limit on the number that can be going through the licensure process.
Yeah, so Katie, that's the awkward thing, because at the time that the bill was written, charters had more flexibility, but now that there is a pathway for provisional licensure that did not exist in 2013 or had been phased out in 2013 because of No Child Left Behind, now traditional public schools have more ability to, you know, they could have lots of people on those provisional licenses. You know, I'm not sure exactly what the accreditation standard says right now, but they could have, they could have zero. Zero people could be on provisional licenses because the pathway didn't exist, but now it does.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of schools that have a lot of people on those provisional licenses. And so, yeah, that context has really changed. So you could argue that charter schools have a steeper hill to climb at this point in time because, you know, the world around us has changed.
Yeah, maybe that's just the justification for it.
The other way to read that is that if people are exempt, it doesn't have any time frame on it. To me, that means they're exempt. Like you can, half your teachers don't have to be licensed, period.
Mm-hmm.
So I read that as more flexible.
Yeah, I can't remember who I just had a conversation about this, but as far as I know, in the conversations I've had with, you know, folks at MDE and others kind of around MDE is that, yeah, at this point, I mean, you can be provisionally licensed and you're just considered licensed. So yeah, I mean, this is becoming a higher and higher bar. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's a good idea to have A and B language based on what the legislature's willing to do. But I mean, as Rachel talked about, like the changing political context, I think you've got a lot of legislators interested in kind of loosening teacher requirements because they know that there are things going on that we need to address in the teacher pathways. And so there's this kind of general like willingness or dissatisfaction with teacher pathways and willingness to sort of do different things. But beyond that, I think, you know, and I think the messaging is obviously that charter schools are supposed to be laboratories of innovation, and these can be places where we can figure out that stuff. And these, and you know, obviously to have to adhere to heightened regulations in the charter sector doesn't really make any sense when the traditional sector is recognizing that these are big issues for them when it comes to teacher pathways. So I like it.
You're muted.
Is Jordan the one who's sharing the screen? Like, it might be helpful if, Jordan, could you like maybe do a mark through so we can just see on the shared screen?
Yep, I can do that. Okay.
Yeah, so it made it have lots of weird spaces, but that's
Yeah.
okay.
It does that when you convert to Google Docs sometimes.
From Word to Google can get
Yeah.
one.
So we want to remove this.
Yeah, so that would just be like a strike through.
Yeah. Let's see if it'll let me do that.
Did the federal laws require bachelor's degree and all of that? I don't.
So for under highly qualified teacher, the federal law was very clear. Bachelor's degree and subject area competency for charter school teachers was the federal bar. I would
Okay.
have to go back and read ESSA to see if any of that was changed or removed in terms of the charter school federal bar for teachers, because that was very clear before that was, but that's something, Lisa, we need to go look up to see if they changed that, because they did take out highly qualified teacher, but they had like a special, this is how this applies to charter schools.
And is there anything about administrators? Because now there's no administrator requirements with striking out that sentence, because
That's
it's not
right.
in the first sentence with the federal
Right.
law.
To my
Right.
knowledge, there's never been anything about administrators. That's a
Okay.
state decision, right?
It's state, yeah. So I mean, that was part of why we had that language in there about administrators have to have a bachelor's degree as a minimum, because it was not addressed in the
Okay.
federal law.
Yeah.
And we wanted to be able to exempt them from state administrator certification, but we did want people to have a bachelor's degree at a minimum. So it might be that we might want to edit the first part of that strike through to just say administrators must have a bachelor's degree as a minimum.
I think the big changes with regard to ESSA and teachers are that they leave the definition of what a highly qualified teacher is up to states now. So there is not a federal, there is no longer kind of a federal requirement related to teachers, but it's just however your state determines that teachers are licensed or should be licensed is what you should adhere to.
I think this is something I might want to go look up just to make sure that we're not inadvertently tying ourselves in a little bit of a knot with the federal law refers back to the state law. The state law says what it says for traditional public schools, and then we've now changed it to be exactly the same on that
Yeah.
little train. So that's something I think I want to go, I'm going to put it on my list to go just double check.
So that's an argument for leaving in some kind of percentage, because that builds in flexibility. If this does circle back all the way to the state law and licensing requirements are somehow aligned to what a how the state, I guess that would be MDE, I don't know, defines a highly qualified teacher.
Yeah.
Because if you take the exemption out,
Mhm.
and this somehow traces back to what the state requires, then it's almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right, Jean. That's right. That's why we need to check it.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be more of an elegant legislative solution if we could just take the sentence out and sort of leave it. But you're right. Like if you kind of go down the road and that's what the end destination is, this would have to be explicit.
Christy, Tamala, Katie, you guys have any other thoughts on this?
I don't. I completely agree with what was just said.
Same here, nothing to add.
Agree.
Katie?
Oh, I said, yeah, I agree as well.
Okay. All right. Anybody have anything else they want to add to this language, or do we feel like, Rachel, maybe it's just a matter of going back, double checking, ensuring that we're in good shape before we flesh out the details and put it on a different page? Okay. All right. Then we can move on. Okay. It looks like we're at Team Elise now.
Jordan, I just sent you the document. Do you mind putting it up? I figured it would be a little difficult for me to.
That's no problem at all. Give me just a
Okay,
minute and I'll get it for us.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Avery, while you have access to the CFR and everything, do you want to take a peek at ESSA and the teacher requirements and administrative requirements that might be, well, that have changed perhaps around charters? So we can
Sure.
have access to that. That'd be great.
See what I can find.
Thank you.
Y'all give me just a second. I'm not on my regular computer. Mine's in for repair. So it's just taking me a minute. It's like losing your right hand when you're on a different computer. Let's see. Okay. Can everybody see?
Can y'all see okay? Everybody else? Okay, Elise, you're up.
All right. So my group took a look at 3 code sections that had to do with the charter term and then the regulations that charter schools are subject to and charter school powers. So I'll go through, and so we had a discussion about, what we thought was worth considering. And then we also sent a survey out to every charter school, and every head of school participated in addition to network members and sometimes board members and teachers. So we got some good feedback.
Do you mind sending us the results of that survey, a copy of what you sent out and the results?
Sure.
That'd be great.
So that was really helpful. And then we just sort of applied, based on sort of what we had thought was initially worth discussing in this group, and had some, feedback obviously to back up some of those changes that, and for the most part, we found that, things that we thought would be initially interesting to people were in fact interesting to them. So in this first code section, we asked people about expanding the charter term. This is not unprecedented. There are a number of states that have longer charter terms in the 10, 15, and even 20-year range in some cases. So, and there are a number of reasons for that, but a number of reasons for, why this could be helpful in Mississippi's charter sector. So with feedback, we came back with changing a proposed change for the charter term to make that 10 years instead of 5 years. Most people supported a more formal review at 5-year intervals, which I think is tends to be normal in states with longer charter terms. Obviously, in Mississippi's case, because of the annual review process we have, I think there are questions about how this needs to be worded that we'd be happy to discuss. But in general, obviously, this would be a big change to expand it from 5 years to 10. And this would change, potentially some other code sections, which we can talk about that today, but it would have an effect on other code sections that are obviously time sensitive. So not only expanding the initial charter term and implementing some kind of, more formal review process at 5-year intervals, but also there was high support for expanding the window in which schools could delay opening without having to apply for approval from the authorizer board. So just some flexibility there so that instead of 1 year in which they can delay on their own, 2 years. And so that was something that, it received a lot of support across the board. And then, and before I move on, so those are obviously some big changes, but those are things that there was high support for. Things that, as we discuss amongst ourselves, we recognize that, a longer charter term has some benefits for schools that need to get need time to get up and running, establish their model without the burden of closure looming, and really, and I'm speaking for myself here, but an inordinate focus on testing early on when they are trying to, you know, serve the populations that they have and scale up in an integral way. And then also, I think there are repercussions as far as financing and facilities go in those early years, where a shorter charter term can have a bottleneck effect on a charter sector that a longer charter term could sort of open up. And so because there are states, and you know, as I looked at states that had longer charter terms, these are often states that have really robust charter sectors. And obviously there are multiple reasons for why they have robust charter sectors, but this is clearly one factor that makes, you know, their sector able to grow and be attractive to operators. So that was something that, you know, everyone seemed to think was important in our charter sector and in our working group. And kind of interestingly, I couldn't find this article exactly, but in Arizona, I think they're just a really interesting, and Katie can speak to this having worked there. In Arizona, I think they're just a really interesting model because they have such a robust charter sector. And what they found over the years is that they have initial 15-year charters and then 20-year renewals. And what they found that is when it comes to charter school closures, that typically in almost every case, really, that it's parents that end up closing the schools and not the authorizer boards. In other words, parents are the ones who end up saying, you know, this isn't working for us, and schools eventually have to close because they don't have the satisfaction rates and the enrollment that they need. And obviously that more organic closure process, again, I'm speaking for myself here, not necessarily my working group, but I think should be attractive to the charter sector, to a state charter sector, because again, instead of, you know, the onus being always on the authorizer board to have to come in and take away this option, that it's actually, when schools don't perform, that it's actually families who say this isn't performing for us. And obviously because charter schools are providing an option to people who often, to students who are underserved typically, and often need that other option, an organic closure process, I think should be attractive to us. And so I think a longer charter term can often support that. I'll stop there. I can't remember how we did this with Rachel's group. So if y'all want me to go all the way through and then we can come back and discuss, or I can kind of stop after each major section if we want to discuss. Obviously this is just proposed language. I think there are probably repercussions in other parts of the law that we definitely need to discuss, and then and tweaks to the language itself that to make it match the rest of the law, and state guidance is, we're open to that, obviously. So what would y'all prefer?
I'm good to go ahead and discuss each section at a time.
Okay, so I'll jump in here. And this is probably more about the language on this, on the review. So Arizona has 15-year terms, and so does Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. has like a very robust 5-year renewal point, you know, mark for the first 5 years, and then after 10 years, and then after 15 years. And so even though they have 15-year terms, and so charter schools get that benefit of, especially on the financing side, being able to have like a long-term, you know, do financing deals that extend beyond 5 years. There's still like a very robust review at the 5-year mark. And they close schools at that mark or they revoke, technically they revoke the charter at that mark if necessary. I know that in Arizona, when the Arizona sector first started and they did 15-year terms, they really didn't have any sort of robust review for many years. And then at some point in time, Arizona has redone the way that they hold charter schools accountable. And Katie, maybe you have a better working memory of how this went down in Arizona. But now I think they do have a more robust interim review Whether it's at the 5-year mark or not, I'm not sure, but I think there is a more robust interim review so
Yeah.
that it's not just 15 years and kind of like whatever.
Yeah, we implemented that right around the time that I was there, really looking at like, what have we been able to do or not been able to do over these 15 years. And so they do have that really robust 5-year, so it's 5, 10, 15. And at each of those points, the intent was to be able to close schools if necessary at any of those points, and obviously at any time, if it, really was urgent for our families and our students. But so I think the benefit of it is that I think the burden for closing a school is a little bit higher at those 5-year reviews, just to say like, you haven't had your full contract term to play this out. And as long as you could show progress at that 5-year point, we likely wouldn't. It was if you could show no progress at that 5-year point, that you had not been working towards hitting your goals and you had not been working towards sustainability and improvement in the school, then we would look seriously at closing. And I think that's the right standard.
Yeah, and so I don't know exactly, like, I'm not sure maybe review is the right term, but there needs to be some explanation of what review means as opposed to like the annual review that's already in the law. But I do think it's important that if we extend the charter term, that it's very clear that at these interim marks, there is a robust review that could result in revocation of a charter if a charter is not, doing what it should be doing.
Agree.
And that it should be clear that that is the case, as opposed to, we're going to review you, but it'll just be feedback, as opposed to like something that's more.
Yep.
Because DC is seen, the DCPCSB, worst acronym ever, is seen as one of the highest quality authorizer boards in the country, and they do have a 15-year term there, and that has not prevented them from being able to grow good schools and close bad schools, but it's because they have very clear processes along the way, and they have a very clear what a review means for them at 5 years. And the other interesting thing that they do is that if you do really well at that 5-year review and you're doing really well once you get to your 10-year mark, the 10-year review is not as intense
And that
as
makes
the 5-year review.
That makes such good sense to me. You earn your autonomy as you go along. I mean, to me, that's the way it is. There's a little bit more oversight at the beginning and accountability at the beginning. And then as you prove your ability to serve children and families, and you show that, and you can demonstrate that, then there's less of an intense review as you go along. That makes sense to me.
Well, that's all helpful feedback. I don't know, does anyone else have comments? I definitely think it makes sense to go in and sort of tweak this language so it's not just placeholder, but it matches what we want, which is a more formal review at the 5-year mark, where there can be serious consequences, but where, a longer charter term is giving charter schools that time that they could use to really get up and running and be doing well in that amount of time. So I think that's something we can go back and work on with input from y'all. I don't know if we want to spend time really working through that today, but
I don't think we have the time. Can we go chat about the 2-year and the rationale for that, since the law right now allows a school to request a 1-year delay? What's the rationale? Because the author or the school can come back to the authorizer and request an additional delay and give an update to the board at that point in time on their rationale for that request. So what's the purpose in changing that from 1 to 2?
So I can talk about, what we have considered, but then I think maybe Katie, you probably will want to weigh in on this, and Tamala, weigh in please if you have thoughts. but I think, I mean, it was largely centered around that process of application. And I think just the opportunity for schools to have that freedom to delay without having to get permission for it. And 2 years being a reasonable window for that and not too long, was attractive to schools, obviously, trying to, get through this process without
Yeah, because we and
a
Katie,
ton of hurdles.
Katie and I've talked about this some because right now we're in a position where we have one school that was actually approved in 2018 and has requested a delay until 2025, which that's a long time. And Katie and I talked about this the other day. That's a really long time, and a lot can change in that time frame. And so whether it's financial or organizational, I mean, things can happen clearly. So I just wondered the rationale from 1 to 2, and why would it not be okay for a school to come back every year and say, or whenever they need to say to the board, we'd like to request an additional year. These circumstances have, whether it's a location or financials at that point, whatever it is, the rationale for delay in the opening, why would it be bad to come and give the board an update annually and request that?
So I'll weigh in a little bit on that. I didn't give, I don't think this was the part that I spoke to a lot, but in thinking about that, one of the things is, in thinking about the terms of the board members, it changes, and having presented and gotten approval from one board may change when it's time to get approval if it's another board. In terms of that, I know that was one of the things that I thought about. I'm not sure, at least, Katie, that we talked about that. And then the other is the approval timeline of the authorizer board, with approvals being done in September and school years usually starting July even for charter schools. But with that happening in September and depending on when that has to be presented before that board. So say, for example, if we had even asked for a deferral for that first year, we got approved in September, and say we came back at the December meeting, I can't even remember if there were a December meeting, but now half that school year is already gone. So if we say for one school year, what school year is it? Is it the school year that planning year, is it? So I know when I was thinking about this, as I reread it when Elise sent it out the other day, just thinking about the terms of the authorizing board and when they change and how they change out. And if you have this permission for 2 years without coming back, then a school has that much more time to go towards planning, as opposed to planning to go before the board and do that. So I know we were just thinking that it could be a good justification in that way. But I think Katie spoke more to this when we were actually doing it. So
Katie?
Yeah, and I think the justification or the rationale for wanting the 2 years is, I think that is a time period that's pretty reasonable to need the flexibility. I've seen school buildings and constructions not be ready,
Right.
And like leaders all of a sudden leave because they got a better offer. There's just a worldwide pandemic can break out.
Kidding.
So there's just a lot of things that can happen. And I think that 2-year window is not so bad that things change significantly that would really need that permission. I'm not opposed to an update, like the school coming before the board and giving an update. I think just the having to get permission, those two things feel different because permission can be denied. And I think right now there's no clarity on why that would happen, what would cause it to be denied. And I think with that amount of flexibility, just building that extra year in gives people a little bit of protection that in case for whatever reason there is an arbitrary decision to deny it, they still have the ability to, because again, construction was delayed or there was a pandemic or, whatever the case may be, they still have the opportunity to use their charter and open their school. And I think much beyond that, then it is really important for the board to have a say. But so that was really the reason for it, is just to give more flexibility and more protection for the schools.
Hey, and Katie, something you said I think is really important, because you said charters, once a school is approved, and in your case, and we can just lay that out there if that's okay, and talk about in your case with Republic, because you guys have 2 schools that are in delayed status. So they have an approved application. They do not have an approved charter because the charter is in essence the contract. So I think we want to, wherever we go and wherever we land, we've got to make that really clear, because that can get convoluted. And one person's interpretation of an approved charter in this language right here may mean that we have a contract, and in your case we don't. We don't have a contract for Republic High or for Revive Prep. And so that's, I think that's an area where we would need clarity with that, in that respect. The other piece of this is where the authorizer shall adopt rules specifying the circumstances. I want to push back on that just a little and would recommend we leave it at may, simply because every situation is going to be different. And in your case, for example, Revive Prep is very different, the rationale for delay, than it is with Revive Prep versus Republic High. So those are two very different circumstances and situations. And I think the authorizer, and I want Jean to weigh in on this as being a board member, but I think having us as the board putting together maybe some parameters, some guidelines, or some guidance, but not adopting specific rules, because you cannot possibly know 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, what those circumstances may or may not look like in terms of a denial or approval. I think you lock the board into decision making that and don't give them any wiggle room at all for consideration if you go down that road. And Jean, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I agree with that. I think when you put shall, it's going to create less flexibility for everybody involved. So it's,
yeah.
I agree.
And I think that's fair. And I think there are some ways to tweak that so that so the feedback generally, I think the intent behind any changes around this language is that schools are wanting some clarity around like what circumstances would involve, some clarity around what circumstances would require as far as the authorizer board is concerned, and not just sort of, obviously the statutory language is very vague, and it's not up to the authorizer board, which on the one hand does allow for great flexibility on y'all's part, but doesn't allow for a lot of clarity on the charter school's part. And so I think the intent there is simply that if someone does apply for an extension, that they have some clarity, even if that's basic parameters, on what would require a denial, what would require an approval, what is a gray area. And I think, maybe there's a way to come at that to kind of satisfy both parties here and say something like the authorizer may grant or deny an extension and shall adopt rules, sort of like a may and shall situation, where saying this is, if they can grant an extension, but around the extension there needs to be some sort of clarity. And I'm just sort of speaking for the charter schools on this point, but I'd love, for any charter schools to weigh in here as far as that's concerned, and just to make sure that reflects those feelings on it.
Yeah, I think, and I think the language may be what's tripping us up here, but I think adopting rules specifying the considerations or, the timeline considerations to the degree that there is going to be one, because I think that's where, schools need clarity in how to operate. So know what they need to be considering and thinking about as far as developing a plan, providing evidence, any of that. So I think what's potentially tripping us up here is the requirement that the rules specify the circumstances for which they will be denied or approved.
And I think that Katie, just going kind of back to where you and I've had conversations about this with respect to your two schools, and even back to April, whenever we talked with John and Glenn and everybody, and on that conversation when we had that meeting, we decided then that a modified application as opposed to a complete application, because you guys had two schools that were in delayed status, that a modified application would be necessary for the board, because I'm not want to speak for the board, but I would guess that the board in general would not want to approve another charter to operate without some substantive information about enrollment, mission, essential terms, the goals, what's changed, what hasn't changed, and in particular, your financial condition, which certainly can change over time. And especially out 7 years down the road with the high school in particular, that a lot of things can change, a worldwide pandemic, right? So anything can change there. And I think if you lock yourself into, by statute, requiring the circumstances in which a school will or will not be approved and or denied, I think that gets a little tricky. And again, I'll lean on Jean for this because she is a board member, but I agree that there's room for clarity, and there's room for some really some serious clarity. I know when I talked to the board chairman the other day, there is some unclear language in between the first line and the second line. So an approved charter may delay its opening for 1 year in order to plan and prepare. If they require an opening delay of more than 2, they have to get an extension request. Well, you don't have to get one if you just delay for 1 year. I mean, it leaves that up to interpretation. And so I do agree that there has to be some clarity around all of this. But I'm hesitant to lock ourselves into language that not knowing what the circumstances might be. So Jean, I'll lean on you again.
Should it say, rather than rules, could it be guidelines and maybe not, and leave out the word circumstances? I'm not sure what the issue is. See, we can't predict what the circumstances are, but it sounds like, at least from what you're saying, the schools would appreciate knowing at least something about what how to apply for this and what's how to do it. And that's
no, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's exactly where we are right now, because we have these 2 schools in delayed status, and we've never had this situation before where we had to kind of come together and say, okay, back in April, well, what do we need the schools to do so that we can bring this before the board and they can make their decision based on this evidence? Not a complete application, but the parameters around what would need to be in writing in a request to the board. So going back to what you're saying, some sort of guidance to say a modified application, an updated financial 5-year plan, blah, blah, blah. Some of the things you and I talked about yesterday, Katie.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly, what, again, like I said, I think this is more about the language and being clear that the intent on this is rules that have administrative protections that really identify what the process is, and as a result of that, kind of what the board is considering, right? So if the board is not going to consider an updated financial plan that's not important to them, then it shouldn't be part of the process, right? And so I think that's where I think this would be great to provide the clarity. And honestly, and I think you probably know this, but anytime there's a process mentioned or an approval point mentioned in the statute, there should be rules and process around that really kind of create the framework for how that happens, just so that clarity is there and that there are the administrative protections. And so I think this was one point that we saw that and really would love to see that rulemaking work.
Well, and obviously part of the attraction of rulemaking, I always feel that tension between, where there's vagueness, there's in a sense more freedom, and flexibility, which can be helpful, but then with the rulemaking process, you have clarity that you can't get otherwise. And also in the rulemaking process, there is an established discussion that has to happen where, there's an opportunity for public comment, which I also think is probably part of this for schools as well. So, but if the consensus is kind of, maybe we can soften that language a little bit or make it a little bit more open, then I think, that's something we can go back and do. Is that any objections to that?
I'm gonna let Jean give her vote on that one. Because since she's the board.
Oh, yeah, no, I think that's a good idea to soften it and to get away from the circumstances. And it sounds like it's more about the process for how they do it, so that there's work for the board to do to come up with more guidance rules, whatever is the best. So I agree with that approach.
Elise, if you need me to help you with any sort of like specific language tweaks, I'm available.
Thanks, Rachel. All right, let's move a little bit below. So you can see kind of a trend in the next couple of sections. So again, the idea here is, I think, two-prong in that we have the rulemaking process under the Administrative Procedures Act, which makes a way for, for people to be sure that they can have, take part in the process of rulemaking, but then also provides that clarity. And so again, like, happy to have this conversation, but here in 2A, establishing kind of in that same sense, establishing that a performance framework should be adopted. And please disabuse me of this notion, but when I went through the rules that have been adopted by the board, that these were things that I did not see had been officially adopted, even if they had been, promulgated. So here, and then can you scroll down a little bit more, Jordan? We'll kind of a little bit more. Yeah, and then here again, the authorizer shall adopt rules establishing reasonable pre-opening requirements. Again, like, this is changing. I'm not a huge fan of changing things from may to shall, but only insofar as it provides clarity and it establishes a process for, allowing schools to engage in a discussion about things that are going to significantly affect them. I think that is the point. So if we can, discuss from that being the vantage point, then what tweaks would y'all like to see to this language, or do you think this, goes further than the intent?
I'm just going to go back to what Tommy Carden, who y'all know is founding board member, and joined us yesterday actually for our work session. But what he would always lean on is giving some level of flexibility and working through the may as opposed to the shall, as opposed to not to say that there shouldn't be input from everybody, which is what we're trying to do now, as well as during our conversations and our even down to our monthly meetings, ensuring that people in the field, those that are out there working with boys and girls every day, have a voice, but not locking yourself into policy. And Avery, you may want to weigh in on that, but that's kind of has been his take on this, because sometimes if you continue to adopt rules and put things into law that way, then you lock yourself in as opposed to having more flexibility. So I think I think it's a tricky place to be. I don't know. I'd love to hear what you think there, because I know you've been here on the board since Tommy.
Really sorry, I've been researching this other issue and I wasn't really listening. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
What was the question?
No, I was just saying that the language here to recommend a change, the authorizer may to the authorizer shall adopt rules establishing reasonable pre-opening requirements. I think Tommy has always been a fan of using the word may as opposed to shall, simply to allow for some flexibility, because when you do adopt those rules and you do go out to, for APA and all, you lock yourself in. And then as opposed to providing the flexibility when you don't have to do that. So I just wanted to get your opinion, since you had worked with Tommy closely on some of this initially. And then Jean, I'm happy to hear your feedback as a board member as well.
Well, just to clarify, initially I did not work with them on any of these things, sadly.
Okay.
I really wasn't that involved. Thankfully, until you came along, I got to become way more involved, and I appreciate that. But, I do agree with what Tommy's saying for the most part. The distinction is we're just saying it shall adopt rules. Rules can be amended, but it does require, a process, so that does mean that you might have to wait a longer period of time than you would like. to have to make these amendments. I mean, but they are something that can be changed.
Sure.
So, you know, I could go either way with it. It really, I would defer to the board's preference. This really isn't a legal question. It's more of a, I mean, it can make things more difficult to go through the amendment process. So for that reason, it's nice if you can just have some policies that can easily be changed versus going through APA, which requires specific and stringent timelines. But
Yeah,
that's
and
the only thing I would point out.
Yeah, and that's real. Thank you, Avery. That's really what I was trying to say. It's about more about policy and practice than it is about adopting rules through the APA process. And that's kind of where Tommy was always shooting from in his recommendations. So, Jean, back to you.
Yeah. So what is this solving a problem? Because it seems like it was fine the way it was written, but I don't have enough history to know what problems may have existed because it wasn't a rule, but rather a expectation or requirement that was set.
I'm not aware of any problems, but others may be. Because we do have pre-opening requirements. They were here, they were established before I got here. Those conditions are built into our Epicenter platform. Whether it has to do with safety, health, you know, any of these things down here, insurance, legal requirements, so forth, it's pretty clear and spelled out, as well as the things that you saw yesterday with the new pre-opening checklist. That's very, very, very clear. And it outlines by month, by almost to the day, of what schools would be obligated to do to ensure that they were in compliance with statute, and in terms of best practices. Some of those are listed out as required, and some are listed out as a recommendation only. So it's pretty clear in the guidance that's been developed.
And I, I'll speak from two sides. And actually, I think there's clarity, or there's agreement in both to some degree. I think the thing, you know, when I think about rulemaking is about taking the people who are currently running the office or sitting on the board out of it, and really thinking about like, why do we want rules? It's because it provides some of that continuity and consistency over time, so that if a board does come in and it's like, you know, 3 new board members for whatever reason, and they have a very different point of view, the process takes time, rather than being able to do a quick policy change that can have a really big impact on schools. And I think with a startup, with pre-starting conditions, I think that's something where, you know, I've seen it where people have very different perspectives on what that should be. And so changing it quickly can have big impacts, because somebody may be in the process of opening and a policy could change, and then they could be very far behind when in the past they had been like perfectly on track to opening, simply because of the change. And so the way I think about it, and the way I think about rules, is like kind of protecting the continuity through the change of people. That APA process with the timelines and the requirements just creates, you know, that little bit of safety valve to make people spend time and hear voices, and not have the opportunity to change on a dime.
I was going to say, not particularly about pre-opening, but at least this is like the second one where we see a request for rulemaking. And if I went, and I'm guessing there's probably more that were in your tweaks. Is that correct? Or is there only these 2 requests? But my speculation is that there was some sort of desire on behalf of whoever took the survey that is seeking more clarity in processes. And that may be where this rulemaking push in different places may be coming from. And it may not specifically be that there's been a problem with pre-opening requirements or conditions, but that there's a need for clarity and consistency over time, or a desire for that coming from the sector and from advocates or whoever you included in your survey. Because I think that Katie is right. Like when you see a request for more rulemaking from people who will be the recipients of the rules, it's typically because they are feeling uncertain about something, and they want more clarity in a process to make them feel more safe, you know, like not like from violence, but safe in terms of like being consistent, like knowing what to expect and having those expectations be consistent over time, which is where I think the tension comes from between schools and the authorizer board over time, is when schools have a different perception of what is going to happen than the authorizer board, and then you get tension between the schools, or you get pushback because there's these different conceptions. And if there are clear expectations from the beginning, then people can sort of plan around that and accept that, as opposed to like when we're navigating a space where there's not a lot of clarity. And when the authorizer board first started, I think this is what Avery was alluding to, there was a anti-desire to have any sort of, from particular people, I'm being very diplomatic here, to have any sort of clarity at all about anything. And that allowed you to move, as the Silicon Valley people would say, move quickly and break things. But when you're talking about schools, breaking things is not good. And so like now we're sort of in a phase where we're trying to, where the authorizer, I'm saying we, but I mean the authorizer board and schools are trying together to find a place of a happy medium between no rules and too many rules. And there's just going to be some tension in getting to that happy medium. And I think we're living through that now. And that may be what we're seeing here. That was a long speculative rant, Elise.
Hey, let Jordan is going to share a couple of different documents with you guys now, so that you can see, for those of you that weren't on the work session yesterday, we really have, and Vanda, please jump in here too, because I want you guys to see what has been developed with input from our charters, because I know Champ Carter and Tandem Learning did survey, did have conversations, and did talk with the schools at great length, and get feedback from them and get their input on the charter pre-opening guidance. And so I want you to be able to see where we are and the resources that are available for schools right now. So there is guidance that's available. It's non-binding, but it is very robust in terms of a guidance document and what the expectations would be without having to go out for APA. So this is what I'm talking about. Jordan, if you can make that a little bit bigger, and then where you can link in, let's show some examples of what this looks like, so folks can see this.
Okay, let me make sure that I can get in there. Okay, here's one of the documents.
Okay. So if you go flip back to the other screen for just a second, I'm sorry. So you can see this document right here is a pre-opening document, and it's broken down into categories. So for example, you've got governance and management, and you can see in this case, for the new school operator, ratify bylaws if not included in the application. It is required. It's not suggested. But you can see where there are things for the school to do. So complete your new school form, which is what Jordan just pulled up, that first link that she pulled up. That's a requirement to do. That also goes to MDE, because they have to get their assignment for your school name or number and so forth. So that's part of that. Then if you scroll down just a little bit, Jordan, you can see how this document, see, there's another example, participate in governance training. That's a suggestion for our new schools that are in pre-opening. Keep scrolling, please. Then there's a whole section on staffing, key positions filled, and it gives a link to the board member and school staff spreadsheet that's in Epicenter. That is a requirement that you just report that. All teaching positions filled, that's in there. These are those links to the Epicenter. staff background checks and so forth. And then there's guidance around that. Keep going, keep going, keep going. And if you can scroll down, here's some facility information. These are the things that would need to be done, required and or suggested. So, and then you can click in right there, Jordan's successful pre-opening. Yep, that checklist right there. And then you can open that. And this is the checklist that's out there for schools. Make sure we're in the right one. Yeah. No, don't think that one's it. The one Vanda that you guys use for pre-opening.
Let's see.
I guess my point is that there are already things developed around pre-opening, and I'm not sure why we would need to go out for APA to create anything more robust than what we already have.
So I'll just speak to kind of what Rachel was talking about before. That's helpful. Thank you. I had not, you said that was yesterday that y'all put that up?
Yeah, we have a toolkit that's been developed for all of our schools, and there are, and Jordan, if you don't mind, you can pull up that toolkit, because I'm not sure that Elise and or Rachel were on the work session and or even were able to pop in and or out at any time. But we have been working diligently at the authorizer here to ensure that all of our schools have everything they need in terms of support and resources. And you can look right here at this document. If I'm an applicant and I want to get prepared for my capacity interview, I have not only a PowerPoint presentation, but I have a video that Champ Carter and Tandem Learning put together for us. So I can go on and listen to that. The same with governance. Then if I'm an approved school, here are the things that if I'm new, right? And I'll just use Tamala, for example. So in her case, not all of these were available when she got here. This has been an ongoing, we're working, we're building the plane while we're flying it. None of these documents existed when I got here to the authorizer, or when Jordan or Vanda came on board. So you can see for approved schools, there's the pre-opening checklist, there's a listserv guidance document. It's even listed who developed those guidance documents, the charter school employee fingerprint process. If I'm a new school, how do I do that? And all of that is spelled out very clearly. Finance overview, finance service, the document that MDE does for us. Then there are several different documents with respect to contract law and policy. So if I have a question about any of those things and I'm a new charter operator, I can go into these documents in addition to picking up the phone, calling the authorizer and or emailing. I've got all of these resources available. Jordan, will you click into the state accountability model, please? This is a brand new document that I asked that our technical assistance provider would help me in creating, because I have so many questions that come from our schools, like, is that standard applicable to me or not? So is 3.12 applicable to me as a charter operator? And I think this document is going to help every one of our schools be able to just dive into the document, scroll down to whatever the standard is. Christy, I'm going to use you for an example if you don't mind. Are you okay? Christy?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, I didn't want to call you out if you weren't okay with that. So something came up this year, and it was a question about school improvement. It was a question about the P16. I guess I have to develop a whole entire narrative and policy / application, something or other. But it was not applicable to her. And even though MDE in this case, no offense, Jean, but MDE was assuming that it was applicable to her. And so we said, no, it's not applicable, but having a document like this for our schools is, incredibly valuable. So if I'm Christy and that question pops up, I can dive down into this document. I can go all the way to that section. And Jordan, I'm going to let you scroll all the way down past into the, keep on going, into the performance process standards. Go ahead.
such a large document. It takes it a minute to catch up with
It
me.
is huge. It is huge. But you can see as she's scrolling, every one of those areas are highlighted to say, yes, this is applicable to me as a charter, or no, it's not. Christy, this is the one I was telling you we were working on.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly helpful. And, even as MDE has, folks changing out from positions over there, it is incredibly helpful for us to have something in writing.
Yeah.
Because I'm having to go back and, just like what I sent you, an email that I had saved from 2016.
Right.
When we, first had clarity. So
Right.
yeah, this is going to be incredibly helpful.
So keep on scrolling, Jordan.
Okay.
Y'all just bear with us a second. It is a big document. Okay, so right there where it says schools at risk. So that is partially applicable to charter schools. So for example, if you're a Title I school, you're going to be responsible for, and all of you are Title I schools, you're going to be responsible for some of the federal reporting requirements, but not everything that's built into this, because some of this is built in by the board, the State Board of Education, and not by the federal government. So if it's built in by the state board, you're not accountable for it, and it's not applicable to you. So scroll down just a little bit more. I'm sorry it's taken so long, but it is a healthy document. So you can see there, this, for example, this section is applicable, that entire section is, and then you can see another example where charter schools are already exempt from these standards. And then another section where you're already exempt. So if I'm out there and I'm Tamala or I'm Katie or anybody, DeArchie, whoever I am, and I have a question about on-site evaluations from MDE, I know I'm exempt from that, right? So I think this document is going to be incredibly beneficial. The pre-opening documents that you saw just a moment ago. And then there is, if you go back to the toolkit.
Yes. Hold on just a second.
I know she's got 14 windows open.
I got a lot of different things going on right now.
I see.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah. So then you can see the same thing with contract guidance. There's a categorical review, and then there's a corresponding contract and general law information. So these kind of take the place of the charter law policy, whatever that policy/pamphlet that was in the legislation. And it actually goes beyond what was required in the law to give even more information to the schools and support for the schools. And then going back to the pre-approved pre-opening checklist, let's say something significant changes in, I don't know, federal legislation and or state law, then it's easier for the authorizer to make an adjustment to that document than it is to go back in and do a new rule. So that would be my rationale for saying leave it at may as opposed to shall.
So I was just going to say that obviously our survey wasn't scientific in the sense that we went to everyone and said, hey, what are the things that you would like to see the authorizer develop rules around? But we did say, based on these code sections, and this vague statutory language, we wonder if people would want some clarity around this. And a significant majority of respondents came back, including, I think, every charter school head or principal except for one came back and said, we'd like to see an adoption of rules around some of these issues. So I do think, that might very well be speaking to a more general sense that there is a desire to have input and clarity on a lot of these issues, but it might be worth going back and kind of gaining, and there may be charter schools on who can speak to this right now, but it may be worth going back and saying, hey, can we kind of have an extended conversation around this? But obviously, I think, the documents you showed us definitely provide clarity. And you said y'all did go to charter schools and get feedback from them on these issues.
Yeah, Katie, you might be able to speak to that. Christy, I don't know who else is still. Tamala, you still here? I can't see everybody, but yeah, I know Champ Carter reached out. You may have gotten calls or emails from William and or from Morgan in this case with respect to the documents that they created. So they actually reached out for input and feedback from the schools on developing those documents that they've created for us. So Christy, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for some of us that's been in it from, the very beginning, you go from having nothing, literally nothing in place to, now, and it is like flying the plane while the manual's being written. So, and I'll use this as an example. You go from having the authorizer walk through your building as your annual assessment to having Schoolworks come in to do, for us, what ended up being a really big assessment during a critical time. So, we've had to painfully live, through some of this process of development, but, from seeing that there was zero on, the front end, I do see where things are being developed. I think it's going to be incredibly helpful. I could see where folks, are quite frankly asking for this, because you just don't know how it's going to impact you, when you don't see what the expectations are. So, and we talked about this, like if Schoolworks, what they had written up in the report is, the expectations, okay, well, we can lean towards that, but if we don't know that on the front end,
Right.
then, we may not know that the bell going off at, X time is important and could be a critical factor for us. So, I think it's just painful living through the development of this because it wasn't done on the front end.
Right.
So, but I can see where this is being developed with guidance.
So as opposed to rulemaking for a pre-opening, just having this guidance available for schools, and Tamala's hopped off the call, so we don't have a new school that can provide some feedback here, but just in general, are those the kinds of things that are going to be helpful? I mean, I'm hopeful that is. We spend a lot of time and energy and reaching out to schools through William and or Morgan, and or surveys to see what your thoughts are on that. So do you feel like those are what we need to do, or do we need to go out and actually adopt a rule that explains exactly what is going to be, or articulates what's exactly going to be in those pre-opening documents?
I think these documents are incredibly helpful. This work is really important. I think the thing that rulemaking does is protects things like this. Because if there's not rules, then Lisa, when you finally win the lottery and you get to go live in, Bora Bora on the ocean, you're not here to make sure that these things continue. And we've seen the world without this guidance and these documents, and there wasn't the accountability that there needed to be for that. And that's what I would say is like the reason that I think rulemaking is still needed is, again, that continuity and that consistency to ensure the board, the staff, whoever they are, doesn't change things on a dime, and then the schools are left kind of trying to figure it out, and at the detriment to students.
And I'll just add, like, this is a difficult dance. Like, between your job, Lisa, as the authorizer, and Jean as the board, and then the job of the schools to try to figure out, like, where is this place of we've made enough rules for people to feel like expectations are clear and consistent over time, and now we can live with them and work within those, boundaries, versus, either extreme where there's, like Christy says, like there was a world we had at the authorizer board where there were literally no rules.
Yeah.
And the danger of that is that I know of specific instances where the previous executive director had informal verbal agreements with people, and then she left, and then it was like, well, does that still apply? Is this going to change? And then it changed, and maybe it needed to change, but it was like, well, there was no documentation of that.
Right.
And that's kind of the difficulty of it, is like finding that happy medium. And I think that on the issue of pre-opening requirements, like all this work done in conjunction with Champ Carter is obviously like really good and valid. And the reason that it was needed was because there was like too much inconsistency.
There was a checklist, and it was
right. It was vague,
and it said things like,
short.
look at the whatever that Ansel or whatever that was.
Right, in the kitchen.
Like, what is that? I mean,
Right.
nobody even knew what that was.
It didn't even make sense.
No.
But at the same time, like, if I think right now, this conversation, we're focusing on the issue of pre-opening. And I actually think that the issue is like what Elise is saying, is like people were reacting to the pre-opening statute because that's what she gave them in the survey. But the bigger issue is this question of what are the list of things in the policy universe beyond these specific code sections that charter schools feel uncertain about what the expectations are, and are seeking more official formal guidance from the authorizer board so that they can live up to those expectations and have the time to do that before they're held accountable for something. Yeah. And so I think that's where maybe we need to find out more from the schools.
Yeah, because I do think that there's an opportunity to go back to what Avery said about not going out for a formal rule, but to adopt a board policy that does this or that. You don't always have to go out, and Avery, correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't always have to go through APA.
No, you don't. It depends on what the regulation is, what the statute provides for. But no, you don't always have to. And in fact, right now, the Attorney General and the Secretary of State are trying to loosen up on over regulation of entities. That's something that they're pushing forward. I'm having to go back through all 14 of my boards and go back through all the regs to try to make it easier for people, not more stringent and hard. So we're going to be moving towards more policies and not having quite so many things just detailed in regulation, so that every time we want some small change or something has to happen, we have to go all the way back through that. You know, can the language not say something like the authorizer shall adopt policies establishing, you know, so that it's clear that you have to have something in writing,
right?
But it doesn't necessarily have to be a regulation, a formal regulation that goes through APA.
Yeah, and Avery, I sort of see like 3 tiers of what you're talking about. There's like the highest level, which is APA 60-day comment period, and then you have to have like, you know, you put it through and then you have 30 days and it finalizes. Right. Then there's things that are board adopted, where it does have to have public review. It goes before the public board and they have to approve it, but it doesn't go all the way through APA. And then there's just like staff level guidance where that's written, where it's a document, but staff can edit it. It doesn't have to go to board review. And each of those have sort of different levels of burden on the you know, policy makers. But I think before we had like not even written, informal, nothing. And now, you know, I think what we're trying to do is find the place in every different issue. Is it, this needs to be staff level guidance? Does this need to go to board review as a written document? Versus like, or does this need to go to APA? And we're getting kind of lost in the weeds about which one of those, when I think that the general point is that schools are seeking formalized things. And we can argue about, does it need APA or just board policy? But I think they're seeking like written formal guidance they can rely on.
Yeah, and I agree, which is why we put together that toolkit and ensured that we had deliberate, intentional, well-defined, focused guidance for the schools and resources for them so that they would have that and they wouldn't be feeling like Christy felt in the early days, like there's nothing, right, for them to go by. So that's really important. And I agree with what you said. It is 3-tiered. And I'll give you a good example of one of those. Our fingerprint policy is, you know, there's a process, but all of the process itself is detailed in guidance from here. But there's a board approved policy as well. So there's 2 phases to that. So there's a step-by-step. If I'm a new school and I need to, have folks fingerprinted, here's what I need to do. I need to reach out to the board, I need to get the ORI card, I need to do this with my applicants, I need to do this, blah, 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 blah. And there's a step-by-step process for that to happen. That's not an adopted part of the rulemaking under APA, but it's a complement to. So they have guidance in addition to a rule.
And my impression is that the first priority for people is clarity. So I do think that, the as formalized guidance is coming out and you're responding to this need for clarity, that is meeting some of what people are feeling. I think there is a secondary priority that I'm getting anecdotally, which is, there are upsides and downsides to the rulemaking process, but I do think an upside is that it creates a clear avenue for comment and appeal. And obviously that is a very formal thing. And I do think that certain rules would meet the requirement, for APA, whereas others wouldn't meet the requirement for that. And by requirement, I mean, I think there's a lot of discretion that the board has as far as like what falls under that and what doesn't. But I do think, if that's an upside of the APA process, I think this perhaps, this merits kind of digging into this issue a little bit more with school leaders to say, like, is the issue really like mainly that first priority of clarity, or is there a sense that you would like to have more input, and does that have to be through the rulemaking process, or is there maybe a way to kind of softly include that language that or include language or ensure that that's happening outside of statute as well?
Yeah, that was why it was so important to us in our conversations with Champ Carter in particular, because they were doing a lot of this work for us when they won that RFP last year, and they were putting together their toolkit pieces with respect to governance and the law and the contracts piece, all of those pieces that they put together pre-opening, that they reached out to the schools and either via email or by phone, and they did provide feedback to us based on the feedback that they got from the schools. So yes, we've got to have input from them, and we certainly appreciated the work that Champ Carter did on all this, because they produced valuable resources for the schools without having to go out for APA on this. So,
and I think like there's sort of a triaging of, on an issue that is not going to make that big of a difference to the schools in terms of the practical realities,
right?
Then just written guidance from the authorizer board that could be changed is not. And if it does change, it doesn't make as big of a wave. Whereas something that's like foundational to operating school, and if it changed overnight, it would kind of be like a big deal.
Of course.
That should have a higher burden of, more formalized processes for clarity and transparency and public comment. And Elise, maybe this is something that we can talk to the schools about, like, can you rank which of these things are so foundational to you? Like, they really need to go through an APA type process versus like pre-opening specifically, it's going to obviously be extremely important to new schools and make no difference at all to schools that are already operating. Mm-hmm. And so the burden is kind of different for different people. And a pre-opening checklist is different than pre-opening conditions, which if you don't meet, you literally can't open. Like that.
That's correct.
Right.
And some of that is in statute. There's
right.
that in statute already that says you cannot open without these things. So that's conditional based on statute, not on a checklist.
So I think like we've gone like a really long time on pre-opening, and I almost think pre-opening specifically is not really the point. It's this larger question of like, what's the right balance between the level of transparency and clarity and input that's required when you make like what level of change.
Totally agree with that, Rachel. And one thing I do want to say with you and Elise both, when you guys are reaching out on behalf of, because I consider this a partnership, right? I wouldn't have invited either one of you to serve as team leads on this legislative task force if I didn't value your opinions and value your work and respect what you do and the experiences that you've had and brought to the table around the charter sector in Mississippi and outside of Mississippi, in your case, Elise. But what I want to say is that we should all be on the same team. And so when you guys are surveying or you're gathering information or you're providing feedback, we would like to be a part of that. Collectively, we're going to do this together. And when we go forth to the legislature to bring forth any of these things, we've got to speak with one voice. We have to say the same thing. You have to say, Elise has to say the same thing that I have to say, that Rachel has to say. If we're going to be advocates for the schools, and whether on behalf of whatever the conversation here going forward, we have to speak the same language. And Elise can't say one thing and Rachel say another thing and I say another thing. So ultimately, wherever we land with respect to legislative recommendations in terms of technical amendments or all-out changes, whatever that looks like, we have to be one voice together to make that happen. Otherwise, the legislature is going to look at us and say, they're Ned and the Primer. They don't know what they're talking about. They've got one group over here of advocates saying one thing, another group of advocates saying another thing, and the authorizer board is advocates saying another thing. So I do think it's incredibly important that when you guys are gathering information on behalf of the authorizer, that we have a voice in that as well and can be a party to that conversation.
Sure. Yeah. I'll share with you all the survey and I think, you know, maybe so we can move on from this, we can say we agree on the current language, but there needs to be a larger conversation around what this seems to have revealed about as far as charter school feeling on some major pieces. So, and then we can talk about what that looks like, if that sounds good.
That sounds great.
All right.
I wanted to belabor that issue so long. We got kind of bogged down in the weeds on that one.
Well, yeah, I thought we would get stuck on the last part actually, so hopefully that will go faster. We didn't see a need to really change anything with regard to charter school powers. I included all of the language just so, you know, so people could see it, but we didn't have, you know, much to say on this. It seems pretty broad, and there wasn't much to change. So moving on to the next code section. This is with regard to traditional public school regulations that charter schools are subject to. And so they're listed out, and Jordan, if you can keep scrolling down, we just kind of did an initial assessment and then asked people about, you know, which provisions they might want further freedom from. And I think there are real questions around this, and obviously we're running short on time, so I may just present this and then we can decide what to do from there. But if you keep scrolling down, we asked them about, we asked them about the section that requires publication of the Mississippi Report Card by the State Board of Education. This is largely requirements for the state, but there is a requirement for school districts in here to publish their accountability scores in the local newspaper. And then also, I think obviously anything I have italicized, I think is a real question as far as like how this would affect federal and state requirements around some of these issues. Go ahead.
Elise, isn't the report card a part of ESSA?
Yeah, so I wouldn't take this out lightly, and it's italicized just because I want to talk about it. And it was something that actually, this one was, oh no, it wasn't, sorry, it was another one. This one definitely had some support. I wouldn't say it was, you know, overwhelming support for taking this out. And I think part of the reason it even came up was because, you know, there was a feeling that why should charter schools have to abide by some of these unnecessary, like, publishing like a whole analysis in your local newspaper, that's money, that kind of a thing. But I think there's a larger question legally, and I don't have the answer to this, of, you know, because of what this represents, would deleting this create a bigger issue as far as fulfilling federal and state requirements. So that is just kind of to show you that we considered it. I don't know that our final recommendation would be including it, but we did ask people about it. A little bit lower, there were related to expulsion. So the thinking there was that, you know, charter schools were saying, why should we necessarily have to expel or suspend students? What if we want to deal with them differently? Why do we have to be subject to these requirements for traditional public schools? I think there are obviously, you know, some potential implications here, and I wouldn't say So there was definitely support for deleting the provisions related to expulsion and suspension. But again, I wouldn't say it was overwhelming. It was generally about half of the respondents were saying, yeah, that sounds good to us.
That's a really old section of the law. That was that whole 3 strikes you're out kind of law. Isn't that part of that old? Yeah, that's a really old section.
And it's really difficult for the schools because we, a lot of us have a perspective of keeping our students and our families in and really, restorative justice, and not being able to do that is a big problem. And it, contributes to a lot of racial issues, perpetuation of white supremacy, and like a whole lot of stuff that I think we really, we feel strongly that needs to go.
So each section here that's got a line on through it on all the way from 18 to 19, those 3 sections right there in particular?
Those 3, yeah, that deal with suspension and expulsion. And I think, I think what we found is that people either didn't feel anything about it or they felt strongly about it.
Yeah. I can see that.
Then, yeah, so those to me seem like they don't have a lot of other repercussions to give schools the freedom. And again, I think there is a legal question there, but to give schools the freedom to deal differently with students who come to school with a firearm or whatever it may be, that seems like a worthwhile consideration for kind of releasing charter schools from some of the traditional things that public schools have had to do. And then if you scroll down just a little bit more, I'm just kind of running through these. The most popular one that we asked people about was, was this section 63, or 371363, subsection 1, which prescribes the minimum number of days. This is the only part of that code section that charter schools are subject to. They have to be in session for 180 days. And this was the most popular in our survey for deleting this provision, the most popular answer.
I have a question about that, Elise. Did you guys talk about MAEP funding with respect to that or not?
We did not talk about that with people. We just asked them. So again, like this is limited in that people are answering the questions that we ask them, and we offered an opportunity to provide more context. But yeah, I mean, do you want to talk about that a little bit, Lisa, actually?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was reading the chat.
Sorry.
I missed that. I'm sorry. Yeah, I just wondered if you guys had any conversation about that, because right now, and Rachel can help me in this because she's the MAEP expert, but I think that could potentially impact our funding if we went outside that 180 days. I don't know that for sure, but there's maybe that potential.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to go back and look where in MAEP it discusses the minimum number of days, but I do think it does say in MAEP that if you don't have 180 instructional days, that you can't get all the MAEP dollars.
Yeah.
Elise, did people give you a sense of like why they wanted the ability to have a school calendar that was few? Because usually our charter schools want to have like add more days to the calendar. Right. So did they discuss like what it was about, like why they didn't want a minimum bar?
I can answer if you let me jump in. I think we have an extended day. And so like when you total instructional hours over maybe 160 days, not that we would actually want to go to 160 days, we still end up with the same number of instructional hours. And I think, we're supposed to be held accountable for outcomes, not, inputs. But B, like the need to have professional development, which is something we invest highly in, and the way that impacts our school days. We may be at like 178 or 179 and have to add more days just to hit that 180 mark versus hitting a total overall instructional hour mark that we think is more important, and also having time with our teachers to develop them, which we think is really important. And so trying to figure out that right balance when it's a day or two off and can be problematic.
Yeah, so I think Katie said it. I mean, that's kind of the feedback. And I think a lot of that just speaks to, again, a lot of these things speak to general principles. The general principle, I think, with regard to this code section being that charter schools are, you know, interested in whatever other flexibility they can have to differentiate themselves from traditional public schools. But with regard to funding, I mean, I think that is a real question, and all of these are tied to other code sections in state law in some sense, which obviously you can't delete these lightly. I think when it comes to suspension and expulsion, that seems clear cut to me, but I think there also could be some other implications, and we have not fully explored all of this. We've done an initial run through, but not fully explored them. So this is more of an introduction, and would love to get feedback about, you know, what more we should be doing. I think, you know, that represents this next section, which is the Mississippi Compulsory School Attendance Law. There were some concerns about just the things that schools have to do with regard to truancy, reporting, that I think has been frustrating to schools depending on their context. But again, I think that, you know, I think that's very much tied to the deletion of this could result in some unintended consequences because it is tied to other state law that governs the education system in general. So that's kind of, so I would say, just for your knowledge, the things that people were most interested in were the minimum number of school days. There was definitely interest in the expulsion and suspension pieces, and the compulsory school attendance law piece. And so I wanted to include those here. I, again, would caveat everything by saying we have not fully explored how, I think there are real legal questions surrounding almost all of these, if not all of these. But when we surveyed people, we asked them about these provisions, thinking that there could be some interesting feedback, and there was, and that there, you know, there was either there was a certain level of interest to a lot of interest in deleting these different provisions. So would love feedback, but I think definitely the legal implications need to be fully explored.
You know, I might suggest, because our time is limited with this task force, that we take the most important areas for this year, address those, fully vet those, have, you know, all of our questions answered, the intended outcomes, the unintended outcomes, address all of that, and then circle back throughout the year to extend conversations around some of these other issues that may and are in many cases related to other code sections, and maybe work through those in a more timely and efficient manner throughout the next 6 months to a year, where if there's something like that's a, you know, front burner kind of issue that we really, really, really need to address this year, that's going to give flexibility and relief to the schools, that we really attack that this year, and then come back with all of our ducks in a row the next session. So that's just my thought, and I'd love to hear your feedback on that. Jean, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, I agree. And I have to leave. I'm sorry for another meeting. So I totally agree. There's a lot. And once you start opening it up, it's like, oh, wait, let's do this. Let's do this. And it really should be prioritized of what's like hurting. Let's fix it. And this sounds like a lot of great issues, and they need a lot more discussion.
Agreed.
So I agree with that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your time again today. She spent the past 48 hours with us.
So I was just going to say about this issue with the school days before we move away from it. One of the awkward things here is that the length of a school day for like instructional hours purposes is actually in the accreditation standards. It's not in law, and charter schools are not bound to the accreditation standards. But that's how MDE sort of gets like an instructional day is 330 instructional minutes, right? And there's nothing in law that says like what an equivalent instructional day is if you extended days and had 160. And so like this might require some thinking about how to have like a minimum bar in terms of instructional hours versus days. Because I could also see how if you were trying to move to a mastery-based system, like say we ever had a charter school that was like that was focused on kids who were like several grade levels behind, and they wanted to move them more quickly through grades. They didn't want them to sit 100. Yeah, and they didn't want them to sit 180 days and say the 4th grade when they should be in the 7th grade, and move to a mastery based. But we have these like barriers. This just may require some extra thinking about how to deal with this and not trip up through the MAP, because we could delete it here, but if it still says it in MAP and it still defines strictly by like calendar days, regardless of instructional minutes, you're still going to get caught, even if we delete it here, if it's in some other part of the code. So this just might require some extra thinking, but it could be a very positive change for like future models of charter schools that may want to come that are mastery based, not just for high schools, but also for like, you know, serving populations in elementary and middle school that have gotten really far behind, so to help those kids catch up. If that made sense.
Yeah, it definitely does, and I think that's right. I think if we need to focus in on a few issues, I'd love to kind of have a survey that allows us to do that.
Sure.
I think for Republic, any of the ones that I've flagged, which I think is very serious, that have, you know, implications around our core value of leading for racial equity, are going to be really high on our list. Those things that we are, through the school system, involving families in the legal system, we're going to want kind of that flexibility around. So those are really high priority for us. And then I think there were a couple of others that, you know, like the school terms, and a couple of others that would be really helpful.
Okay, we can put together a survey, I think, without any problem, and get everybody's feedback in terms of top priorities to address, and then really put meat on the bones with respect to what we want to ask from the legislature this year and how we want to approach that, as well as the language that we want to, you know, whether it's an elevator speech or whatever we want to do, our talking points, however we want to craft that, so that we do all stay on the same page and speak the same language, not just in terms of our ask, but also in terms of our rationale for, so that we do speak with one voice. So if we can just agree that that's an appropriate next step, to put together that survey, come back. I know we have another meeting in January. Come back together, flesh out any details or recommendations with respect to Team A and Team B, or Team Rachel and Team Elise, and then go from there. Does that sound okay to everybody? Feel right?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, thank you, Christy. Okay, well, we too have another meeting. I think we may be running over, and Vanda may have had to step off to get involved in that other one. But anyway, thanks again for everybody's time. I wish you the best for the holidays. Stay healthy. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and we'll see you in the new year.
Thanks, everybody. Happy
Thanks,
holidays.
everyone.
All right, bye.